place that 415 million of us flew last year alone. Most of us never think about what we might do if a fire were to break out on board. A fire that would be fast-moving, terrifying, and deadly. There would be panic and hysteria as people struggled to escape. Most of us have no idea how we'd get out or how desperately little time we'd have to do it. In this simulated fire, the volunteers had only a realistic 90 seconds to escape. Those who took longer were considered dead. Accidents in aircraft are very rare. When they do happen, more than 80% are survivable accidents, when the impact itself isn't severe enough to kill people. But over the years, many people have died in survivable accidents, and most of them died from smoke and fire. Paris, France, 1973. This 707 landed only 8 minutes after a fire broke out in a lavatory. 124 passengers and crew died from the smoke and fumes. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, 1980. This L-1011 made an emergency landing with a fire on board. All 301 people, including the captain and crew, died before they could escape. Malaga, Spain, 1982. This DC-10 bound for New York with 394 passengers caught fire when it crashed on takeoff. Flames swept through the crowded fuselage. 50 people died. Manchester, England, 1985. This 737 abandoned takeoff after the captain heard an explosion. The plane, ablaze with burning fuel, continued down the runway. People in the terminal watched helplessly as the crippled aircraft was engulfed in flames. Many people did escape somehow, but 55 died in a plane that never left the ground. Roy Metcalf was a passenger on that plane.
The flames came through the windows and up onto the ceiling, and all the ceiling started to burn. And then it rapidly spread. It was the heat of the cabin. It was so hot that you could feel your flesh creeping like that. And I think myself that it was the seats, the foam had reached the flash point, and they just went up. And the thick black smoke came down, and that's all there was to breathe. And when it got to the top of the aircraft, which was burning, and there were tongues of flames going along the fuselage of the aircraft, this stuff came down like rain. And your ears were filled, your nose was packed out like a gorilla, and your eyes were all full of this filth on the seats. People were on fire. I saw one lady who had just had her hair done, and it must have been very heavily lacquered, because all of a sudden, and her hair went, the lock went, it reached its flash point, and she, in a panic, ran the wrong way. Some people came over the backs of the seats because the aisles were absolutely jammed full of people. And I got into the aisle and went with the crowd. Just went with the crowd, which was very, very slow indeed. I couldn't see a thing. I knew I was in row 9, and I had the presence of mind to put my right hand out and count the seats as I went down. And I got to about row 4 and put my hand on somebody's head and knocked the glasses off. And I thought, well, he or she is a goner. And then I got a little further on, and my left foot got caught under somebody's armpit that was on the floor, because there were bodies, seemed to be bodies all over, or in someone's crutch. And that foot was captive with the weight of the people behind me, and I fell then, I think, into row 2. I was choking, this acrid cyanide smoke, 2 whiffs, and I'm quite sure you'd have had it. As I say, I fell into row 2, and I felt this drifting, floating sensation. There was no sense, there was no sight, obviously. There was no, and just before this, the flames were roaring. There was no sense of hearing, no sense of smell, no sense of taste, and no sense of touch. You seemed just to be suspended for, it seemed, about a week. And then I heard a voice saying, "Roy, get onto the floor, the air will be clearer. And I realized that it was my own voice and that I actually was on the floor. And I always keep a hanky in my top shirt pocket. And I picked the hanky out to try and breathe through it. But my mouth was full of this filth from the seeds, and I put my finger in my mouth and brought it out like crumbled OXO cubes. That was all there was to breathe. And then I'd lost my glasses, and I got the hanky and opened my right eye and pulled the handkerchief across my eyeball to get rid of this muck. And by doing that, I saw a little light as big as a postage stamp towards the bottom left. And I made a beeline for it. I've been asked before, did I crawl, did I walk, did I run? I don't know. I'd gone down the chute, head first apparently, through about 4 foot of foam. And as I looked up the chute, I saw the whole top of the aircraft just dissolve like a little piece of house foil. And there was this tremendous bang, which I must have passed out by then. And the next thing I knew, I was being swabbed down in hospital.
Investigation of the Manchester accident began at once. An engine overdue for maintenance had exploded, igniting thousands of gallons of fuel. Flames melted the windows and entered the cabin even before the plane came to a stop. Evacuation was delayed by panic, confusion, and emergency doors that wouldn't open. 46 of the victims were killed by smoke and toxic gas. The $20 million plane was destroyed. Britain's aviation authorities have corrected the design problem that led to the devastation here. This particular combination of events may never happen again. But why did it happen at all? Are current standards of air fire safety as stringent as technology permits? What regulations protect the flying public? Who makes the regulations and who enforces them? In the United States, 2 government agencies are involved. One is the National Transportation Safety Board.
The Safety Board investigates aviation accidents to determine the probable cause of the accident and to determine as well why the people are killed and injured, and then to make recommendations to, number 1, prevent the accident from reoccurring, and secondly, to prevent needless deaths and injury in the future.
Because it is first on the scene of an accident, the Safety Board usually has a very clear picture of what went wrong. After each investigation, it recommends changes to ineffective or obsolete safety regulations. But despite its familiarity with the grim reality of airline accidents, the Safety Board can only recommend changes, not require them. That's the job of the Federal Aviation Administration, which creates and enforces all the regulations that affect air travel in this country. The FAA also conducts its own fire prevention and protection research.
We actually have, in cooperation with industry, an extensive research and development program. Typically, we spend somewhere between $5 and $20 million a year, depending on the year and the projects underway, in research programs designed to understand better how to survive in the event of an accident that involves fire.
The most deadly threat in an aviation accident comes from fuel. Thousands of gallons of kerosene are carried in huge tanks in the wings and fuselage. If those vulnerable tanks rupture, as they easily do in an accident, the spilling fuel can erupt in a spectacular fireball. In the 1940s, researchers used red-colored water in the tanks to discover why liquid fuel was so dangerously explosive. When the fuel tanks rupture, the spilling liquid trails behind. Then it sprays forward in a mist of tiny droplets that would be highly volatile if this were fuel. In lab tests, they saw how liquid kerosene mists and ignites almost instantly when it's propelled over a flame. But when they blended the kerosene with additives to form a kind of gel, it didn't ignite at all. Throughout the 1960s, the FAA experimented with gelled fuels. If gel didn't explode in accidents, hundreds of fire deaths might be prevented. The final test was in 1973.
We ran a series of tests up at Lakehurst using cashiered Navy aircraft, and we had pretty good results up to a certain point. And then, being typical engineers, we wanted to get as much as we could out of that last test. We changed quite a few of the parameters, such as the number of ignition sources, the intensity of the ignition sources, the concentration of the additive.
But perhaps because of those changes, the final test of gelled fuel burned catastrophically.
The FAA got quite skittish at that point and said, what are we doing here? Well, those of us that were involved said we weren't making mistakes. We just made some poor judgments in that test. And I guess the program went on hold for a period of a couple years.
While the FAA was still studying gelled fuels, research in Britain went off in a different direction. Private industry developed an additive for ordinary liquid kerosene that would eliminate misting in a crash.
This is what we finally came up with, a free-flowing liquid, until it's violently agitated.
The agitation causes the long chain molecules of the additive to surround the molecules of kerosene so that instead of making a fine mist, it forms large, hard-to-ignite globs.
This is the raw material, FM9, fine powder, difficult to handle, so we formulate it into this liquid composition which is added during the aircraft refueling operation.
It was a bold concept, a fuel that only burned when they wanted it to. Laboratory tests were promising, but after 6 years of development, British industry lacked funds and government support to flight test FM9. Then, in 1977, the disastrous accident at Tenerife gave tragic significance to fuels research around the world. In the U.S., Congress funded a new safety fuels program. Using the British FM9 compound, the FAA began testing anti-misting kerosene, or AMK. When ordinary Jet A fuel was blown over a simulated wing at 100 miles per hour and onto an open flame, it formed the expected fine mist and explosive fireball. But when Jet A with the anti-misting additive was tested, as seen here in slow motion, there was no misting. Instead, the fuel formed large droplets and did not ignite at all. Under these controlled conditions, AMK showed great promise. After 300 successful experiments and 30 hours of flight tests, the FAA decided to push ahead with a dramatic full-scale demonstration of AMK. Working under pressure on a speeded-up schedule, FAA's safety fuels team prepared for a landmark in testing procedures. On December 1st, 1984, this Boeing 720B, fueled with AMK, was to be deliberately crashed in a so-called typical accident at Edwards Air Force Base, California. Dummy passengers were part of FAA research on crash survivability. The demonstration, a joint effort of the FAA and NASA, was designed to show that AMK could effectively reduce the threat of catastrophic post-crash fires. A successful test would almost certainly mean that the FAA would recommend anti-misting kerosene as the standard industry fuel. As the pilot in the control room guided the plane with NASA's newly modified remote control system, all the world's press was watching. The plan was that as it crashed, these cutters would rip open fuel tanks in the wings. The AMK would spill and some would burn, but not engulf the plane as it skidded along the runway. But the accident did not go according to plan. The remote control landing was imprecise. The plane wobbled badly, crashed short of the target, and skidded sideways into the cutters, ripping open the fuel tanks and engulfing the fuselage in flames. Bill Westfield's reaction?
Kind of sick. No, I knew something went wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that we had a lot of work ahead of us.
Viewing films later, the research team could see how the debacle developed. The cutters stopped engine number 3 almost immediately. Fuel poured directly onto the white-hot engine and ignited continuously as the plane skidded along. The typical accident had been compromised by a faulty remote control system. Still, AMK's performance was a disappointment. Seen in slow motion, it's difficult to imagine that anyone could have survived. Yet the impact had been so modest that experiments on crash survivability had been a waste of time. The only flames that got inside were from doors that opened in the crash, and those flames cleared within 9 seconds. Dense smoke did fill the cabin and would have incapacitated many people. The FAA estimated that of the 53 passengers on board, 19 would have survived. But overall, top officials of the FAA were not impressed by this test of AMK.
The fact is, the test worked very well, but the anti-misting kerosene did not work well. In this particular case, the anti-misting properties of the fuel did not prove effective, and the aircraft burned very much. It showed us that anti-misting kerosene is not yet ready for use in flight.
The crash demonstration was a failure as a public relations event. But was it also a failure as a scientific test? There was surprisingly little fire damage to the plane. Post-crash analysis revealed that AMK had burned cleaner and cooler than ordinary Jet A.
We saw after the fire had lifted that the fuselage was still in good shape, whereas we know that normal Jet A fuel would have penetrated it. So we set up a test here at our facility to examine what happens when kerosene versus AMK flows over a fuselage under those burning conditions. We found that with the normal kerosene, the fuselage was penetrated in a matter of seconds. And no surprise, we expected that. But when we exposed the same type of fuselage to the anti-misting fuel, well, we just didn't get penetration. It verified that it does provide protection to the skin of the aircraft, even though it is burning. Now, that's not much of a plus, people will say, but if it buys you 20 seconds, that's a lot of time.
Despite such promising evidence, the public embarrassment of the crash test effectively ended FAA funding for anti-misting kerosene research. Brought down by a single ill-considered, poorly timed event, the development of safety fuels is almost entirely on hold. The key to surviving any accident, especially one with fire, is getting out quickly. FAA regulations require that each new type of commercial plane pass the same test. With a full load of untrained passengers, using emergency lighting and only half the exits, the plane must be empty in 90 seconds. This footage shows the test evacuation of Boeing 757. The FAA permits some generous interpretations of its test criteria. These passengers were relatively young, and many wore sneakers and tracksuits. The flight attendants were given extra training. With the highly unusual assistance of the pilot and co-pilot, the plane was evacuated in 90 seconds, and the FAA certified the 757 safe to fly. These tests signify little in terms of real-life emergency situations. So what does the 90 seconds mean?
The 90 seconds is a relatively arbitrary time limit that is set so as to make it difficult to achieve the desired result. The desired result being two things: safe evacuation rapidly, and comparison from airplane to airplane as designs vary, and they do vary markedly, over the years. We use the 90 seconds as a database. It is not a criterion that is set based on survival time.
But the 90-second standard originally was based in part on how long a burning plane remains survivable. Beginning in the 1950s, government investigators deliberately crashed 74 large planes in low-impact accidents to measure conditions inside a fuselage that was burning but still intact. What about visibility? Toxicity? What sorts of fumes and temperatures would be found? Could humans tolerate these conditions, and for how long? They found that overall, the danger from fire and smoke was not life-threatening in the first 90 seconds. Conditions then deteriorated rapidly and quickly became non-survivable. In 1964, investigators used the crashed hull from one of these tests to conduct 4 evacuation trials. The interior of the plane was refurbished, and local citizens, including children and elderly people, were recruited as volunteer passengers. A highly respected crash investigator, Harry Robertson, helped conduct the experiment.
We had them reenact as though it was a real flight. We took the airplane off, we flew it around, came back and landed in sound, but the airplane didn't move, and the windows were closed so they couldn't see. We jiggled the airplane with cables on there, and then as it came in for a landing, we simulated the crash with sounds. We lowered the airplane down, we jiggled it, and at that time, we popped up the shades on the side so they could see out, and we had pans of fuel on the outside burning. We had smoke generators inside of the aircraft filling it with smoke. We had people screaming that were staged to do that. We had some of the doors blocked. We had debris fall down on top of them, and then we filmed it all to get an indication of what the passenger would do in an effort to get out. And we learned some very interesting things. For example, debris on the floor and coming down and hitting them in the head did startle them. And people were confused momentarily on what to do. We had passengers that were deliberately incapacitated, so as though they were injured, and they caused confusion for the passengers not knowing what to do with the injured people. We had some of the doors blocked on the outside, so they couldn't open the doors to get out. We had some of the hatches that were much heavier than they anticipated when they opened them. We found that people tried to go out the same way they came in. But the bottom line was, we found out that getting out of the airplane in 90 seconds is a joke.
20 years later, 90 seconds is still the evacuation standard. But are modern planes really designed to meet that standard in an emergency? Los Angeles, 1978. This DC-10 carrying 197 people blew 2 tires on takeoff. The landing gear collapsed, a fuel tank ruptured, and a fireball engulfed the aircraft. Jana Harkrider was a flight attendant that day.
We heard a loud bang. Then the aircraft began to shudder and shake a great deal. Ceiling panels began to come down. Galleys were coming apart. Magazines and suitcases began flying around. And as soon as the aircraft came to a complete stop, I took a moment and went into the cockpit and advised them that we were on fire. I found out later they indeed did not know that, and he gave the order to evacuate.
Smoke poured in through the open doors.
There was extremely dense smoke, and it was rolling closer and closer to us, and this gray smoke then had a black smoke that followed it. And the black smoke was extremely frightening. It was like walking into a wall, and it was very, very hot.
Outside, burning fuel threatened the second exit from the front, 2R.
Approximately 35 people evacuated out that exit, and then the slide burned up, and the flames moved forward on the right side of the aircraft. We were able to evacuate approximately 100 people or so out the exit at 1R before it burned up, and then at that point there were 8 people left inside the aircraft, mostly flight attendants, I might add. We realized that we had another exit available to us that is not widely publicized, and that's out the cockpit window. And so we went into the cockpit, and we tried to close the door to keep the smoke away from us, and we evacuated down the rope and out the cockpit window.
This evacuation took 5 full minutes. 2 people died immediately from the fire, and 2 later from the smoke. 31 others, including Jana Harkrider, here climbing out of the cockpit window, suffered serious injuries. Because of the Los Angeles accident, the FAA began immediate investigation into why the 2-story escape slides failed so quickly. They found that the standard plastic inflatable slides could burst from radiant heat alone in only 20 seconds. More expensive aluminum-coated ones lasted twice as long, some up to 5 full minutes. As a result, FAA regulations now require that new slides be aluminized. But most planes fly with their original uncoated slides, and the FAA does not require the airlines to replace old slides with new ones. The exits on an aircraft are the only escape route in a fire. For certification, FAA regulations specify only that a full plane must be evacuated in 90 seconds using half those exits. Most 747s, like this one, have 10 exits. But in a move that has divided the industry, some airlines are removing the overwing exits on 747s. Those airlines, none of them American-based, claim they have done it to enhance comfort and improve services for passengers on very long-distance flights. But passengers who recently flew on a modified 747 found something else. In place of the former emergency doors were not more services, but 3 new rows of seats. In the United States, the Association of Flight Attendants has led the fight against removing the doors, branding it a serious reduction in the margin of safety. On unmodified 747s, the maximum distance between exits is 60 feet. With the overwing exits removed, it becomes a very long 72 feet. The FAA recently proposed new safety regulations to limit the distance between doors to 60 feet. But Boeing Aircraft already had plans to produce a whole fleet of modified 747s. And in October 1987, Boeing sued the FAA over the number of doors required. no settlement has yet been reached. Even if there are enough exits, they may be very difficult for untrained passengers to use in a real emergency. In the 737 at Manchester, the overwing emergency doors were very heavy. Many people died piled up behind doors that never opened. And Fire Officer Robert Graham, who investigated the accident, found additional problems as well.
The exits themselves were quite adequate and wide enough to take at least 40 people a minute through either exit at the front. But the bottleneck occurred at the bottom of the alleyway, the aisle leading to the exits, and that was 17 inches wide at its narrowest point. Well, the coroner asked if it had been a building, would we have given it a certificate? And the answer would be no.
Most frightening of all to contemplate is fire in the air. Until the burning plane is on the ground, very little can be done to save the lives of passengers and crew. In June 1983, a fire was discovered on a DC-9 in flight. It had begun in a lavatory, and despite attempts to put it out, soon raged out of control behind the walls. Smoke was so dense that frightened passengers had to breathe through wet towels.
From the time that smoke started coming out, I would say that within 5 minutes to 7 minutes at the most, the back part of the plane, up as far as the cockpit, was filled. It burns your eyes. It would burn your nose. If you tried to talk, you could feel it burning your throat. So it was a matter of sitting there, trying to keep your eyes closed, trying not to breathe too hard, and certainly trying to keep your mouth shut.
Even the cockpit was filled with blinding smoke. After 17 desperate minutes in the air, the pilot managed to land the plane at Cincinnati and ordered immediate evacuation.
I tripped over the sill. I caught myself as I'm going out and got my other leg over the sill, and I had a hold of the side of the plane when it was just like someone had set a firecracker off, and the whole inside of the plane was engulfed.
Brenda Main was the last survivor off the plane.
All the crew came off the plane, and they had a very short meeting or conversation as they were going up the runway. And the comment then was made that, you know, there should have been something else we could have done, or was there anything else we could have done? And I knew then that there were still people on board. I had no idea, absolutely no idea that it could ever get as bad as that.
23 of the 46 people on the plane died. None of their deaths were caused by the flames. All were caused by smoke and toxic fumes. This shocking fact galvanized the safety board into action. They strongly advised the FAA to make long overdue changes in its fire safety regulations.
The Cincinnati accident resulted in 18 recommendations, all aimed primarily at improving the fire safety of air transport category airplanes.
Among those recommendations were smoke detectors and fire extinguishers in lavatories, smoke masks with oxygen for flight attendants, fire-blocking materials in seats and cabin walls, and improved emergency ventilation and smoke removal procedures. The Safety Board also recommended that the FAA require each plane to carry at least 2 fire extinguishers with Halon 1211, the most effective firefighting agent available. They recommended that all planes be equipped with emergency lighting near the floor to guide passengers to exits when ordinary lighting is obscured by smoke. The FAA responded in part to many, but not all, of the Safety Board's recommendations. Floor-level lights, for example, have been required on all planes since 1985. But the lights are not demonstrated as part of pre-flight safety instructions to passengers, so people may not know how to follow them if there is a real emergency. Critics of the FAA are angered that even such simple and inexpensive improvements have taken too long to be implemented. James Oberstar is chairman of the House Oversight Committee.
The FAA is responsive to economic concerns as well as to safety concerns. There were pressures from the airlines about the costs of such system, about the difficulty of installing it. Boeing Aircraft Company, for example, was very resistant to the idea of getting a floor lighting system on board. It took over a decade to get the FAA to issue the regulations that now require on-board proximity floor lighting.
Even before the Cincinnati accident, the FAA's major fire protection strategy has focused on the materials inside a plane. They are inexpensive, lightweight, comfortable, and potentially deadly. A typical plane is furnished with 2,000 pounds of different plastics, which all give off highly toxic gases when they burn. The FAA's extensive research program on these materials, under the direction of project manager Gus Sarkos, is based at the FAA Technical Center near Atlantic City. For 30 years, it has been the most comprehensive air fire test facility in the world. This retired C-133 has survived more than 500 fires. Inside, its walls are filled with concrete and fiberglass so that the fuselage cannot burn through. Flammability tests can then be conducted on different materials under identical conditions. Such a plane is virtually fireproof, but so heavy it could never leave the ground. This is the heart of the FAA's long-term fire safety strategy, to fire-harden aircraft interiors so that they will burn slowly or not at all. Although critics object to the limited scope and slow pace of the program, Sarkos's research greatly improved flammability standards for the lightweight, comfortable materials the airlines and the public demand. Most airline seats are made of lightweight, inexpensive polyurethane. This one weighs just under 4 pounds. Weight is a critical component for the airlines in keeping costs down. But the polyurethane melts virtually in seconds, disintegrating into a sinister cloud of highly poisonous gas and smoke. After 2 minutes, only the frame remains. In another test, the same type of cushion and the same fabric is used. But between them is an extra layer of Norfab, a fire-blocking material that adds to both the weight and the cost of each seat. But it also radically reduces its flammability. Exposed to the same intense 2,000-degree heat for the same length of time, the seat remains nearly intact. Such fire-blocking materials were developed by NASA in 1970, but they were too heavy for the profit-conscious airlines. After Cincinnati, the FAA finally issued a timetable for airline compliance with a minimum flammability standard for cabin interiors. But cabin interiors will still burn in the intense heat of a fuel fire that gets inside. This is a full-scale fire test filmed in real time. Gus Sarkos.
The right-hand side of the airplane, a fire is penetrating through an opening. It is a post-crash fuel fire. The main violation to the interior from the fire is from the intense radiant heat, and you can see the materials are beginning to burn. Smoke is coming off of the seats. Some of the seats across from the aisle are also beginning to decompose. It's very interesting that the combustion products have a tendency to accumulate up at the ceiling. This is what is called by some fire modelers and scientists the two-zone effect, where the combustion products are mainly concentrated in the ceiling level, and in the lower zone, the environment is pretty near being clear air.
At 53 seconds, the burning materials have released intolerable levels of poisonous fumes and gases. Temperatures range from 90 degrees near the floor to more than 2,200 degrees near the ceiling. The fuselage has become a gas chamber. A real fire would be much worse. There would be hysterical people scrambling to get out, carry-on luggage burning and blocking the aisles, and a great rushing and churning of air as emergency doors are opened.
With time, the fire intensifies, but remains by and large localized in the immediate area of the original insult.
90 seconds. Surprisingly, there is still enough oxygen left to breathe, but it is saturated with dangerously superheated gases. Any people still struggling to escape would just barely be able to see below the smoke.
However, later on, a phenomenon which is called flashover occurs. A very rapid and uncontrolled fire growth. As you can see, when this flashover phenomenon occurs, the entire cabin is blackened by smoke. And from our analysis of the products of combustion, we calculate that the survivability will be lost within a matter of seconds.
Even cabin materials that meet FAA flammability standards give off deadly poisons when they do burn. The victim breathes in acid gases, hydrogen chloride and hydrogen fluoride. These attack the air passages and produce fluid from their linings. Acid smoke will thickly coat the walls. The smaller particles carry the acids deeper into the lung, causing permanent damage even if the victim escapes. The fluid will foam and fill his lungs, and that alone could kill him. Carbon monoxide also blocks the oxygen supply. From the lung, it's taken up by hemoglobin, flooding the body with poisonous carboxyhemoglobin. This is reversible if the victim gets out. Cyanide also passes through the lungs and into the circulation. When it reaches individual cells, it blocks the use of oxygen. Vital organs fail and the victim dies. 46 of the 55 deaths at Manchester were caused by smoke and toxic fumes. That finding alone has provoked air safety experts in the United Kingdom to look beyond the long-term fire hardening approach of the FAA. They wanted a solution that would provide immediate protection, so they revived a 20-year-old idea developed by FAA engineer Ernie McFadden. In 1965, he investigated this accident and found that 43 people had died from the smoke. He wondered if a simple source of clean air could have prevented these deaths. McFadden used thin plastic film called polyimide, which is so heat-resistant it has no melting point. He sealed it with ordinary staples to make the first smoke hood. It was essentially a large plastic bag for passengers to pull over their heads during evacuation. It scooped up enough air to last 3 minutes, protecting people's heads from heat and flame and their lungs from toxic gases. Although scientists were concerned that people might suffocate from exhaled carbon dioxide, FAA's first trials went well. The following year, prototypes were thinly silvered to reflect more heat. Evacuation tests were made more lifelike by adding dense theatrical smoke. Several hundred volunteers evacuated safely wearing smoke hoods with no significant difficulty. In 1967, the FAA said that smoke hoods would be beneficial in a fire and put them on their own agency planes. In 1969, they proposed a regulation requiring smoke hoods for passengers on all commercial flights. But critics, including aircraft manufacturers, objected. In a crisis, they claimed, passengers wouldn't know how to use them, and they might be slowed down by as much as 45 precious seconds putting on the hoods. New tests were done to compare how long it took people with and without smoke hoods to evacuate. Results showed that smoke hoods might slow people down by only about 7 seconds. But in August 1970, citing delayed evacuation as the reason, the FAA canceled the proposed smoke hood rule. FAA money for smoke hood research dried up, and there was little further support for the concept. Yet in 1983, when the FAA commissioned a study on improving survival in aircraft fires, it found that the lowest cost, most effective benefit to passengers in a fire would come from smoke hoods. Even then, the FAA kept smoke hoods on the shelf.
It was demonstrated that smoke hoods can provide a measure of safety for persons to get out of an aircraft in time of an accident with fire, with smoke on board. But the FAA has its vision on the long term, the perfect, trying to achieve that goal of perfection. While waiting for that to arrive, they dismiss other short-term, more useful and lower cost, interim, very beneficial steps. Unfortunately, smoke hoods have been a victim to that long-term goal of achieving protection in other ways.
After Manchester, Britain's Accidents Investigation Branch took the initiative and aggressively reopened the smoke hood question. AIB's senior investigator, Edward Trimble, was impressed with smoke hoods used in the chemical and mining industries and in the military. Why not use this expertise to protect airline passengers in a deadly fire? In February 1986, he challenged 20 manufacturers from around the world to develop smoke hoods for the flying public. There are 2 basic types of smoke hoods. One is a simple filter hood, like this one from Cybertronics.
It has this large area of filter, which takes out toxic gases such as hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride, acrolein, and specifically cyanide.
The filtered air inside the hood lasts for about 6 minutes.
This is a mask which has been through the equivalent of a major aircraft fire, which we've cut open to see exactly what the results are. This particulate filter is electrostatically charged to take out particles of smoke. Underneath this is the activated charcoal cloth, which is impregnated to deal with certain gases, and beneath that again is an activated charcoal loaded foam.
What about carbon monoxide?
This mask does not take out carbon monoxide.
But that could be deadly.
In my experience, the most profound toxicant in a fire is carbon monoxide. The fire statistics, and they're available, indicate that CO, carbon monoxide, is the primary toxicant resulting in fatalities in fire victims.
The other basic type of hood has its own supply of air or breathable gas. This one from DuPont is light and compact. The compressed oxygen supply inside the neck seal lasts about 6 minutes, and deadly carbon monoxide is no problem because of the self-contained air supply. However, the compressed air makes it currently illegal to carry on commercial flights. This very sophisticated version was developed for the British Navy by Sabre Safety. It's quite complicated to put on, but its oxygen supply lasts 16 minutes, even when the wearer is breathing heavily due to exertion or panic. The standard Navy issue air cylinder is bulky and heavy. So the manufacturers developed a small light cylinder that lasts 20 full minutes. None of these hoods was designed for commercial air travelers. Trimble's challenge to industry was to develop hoods that would meet the rigorous standards of Britain's Civil Aviation Authority, or CAA. Hoods would have to be durable, light, and easy to put on, cope with all the hazardous gases found in a cabin fire for at least 5 minutes, maintain a reasonable internal temperature, fit a wide range of people, and be so reliable they wouldn't stop working while there was even a chance of survival. Many of these hoods were tried out in the hot box of a fire training school in Scotland. Pans of kerosene around the box would be allowed to burn as long as safety permitted. Those wearing filter hoods put them on just before going inside. These volunteers were mostly professional firefighters, already intimately familiar with such heat and smoke. They were eager to help assess the relative merits of these different hoods. Inside the box, the temperature exceeds 150 degrees. The firefighters wanted to know how easily they could see, move about, hear, and speak.
If I can hear you in there, but how are you feeling at the moment?
Fine. No problems with this one at all.
No problems?
I can hear you very well. That's very important.
There were no toxic fumes or gases like those found in an aircraft fire, but the heat and smoke were intense, visibility very low, communication almost impossible. After 6 minutes, it was time to put the fire out. This was a demonstration, not a scientific test, but all these hoods performed admirably. It's a long way from a successful demonstration like this one to having smoke hoods for every airline passenger. No technical standards existed. A series of rigorous tests to help the CAA establish that standard were developed by investigator Trimble. All hoods are made of fire-resistant materials, special plastics, silicon rubber, fiberglass, carbon cloth. One performance criterion was that each hood had to protect the head from the hottest part of the flame for 6 seconds. Each filter hood was also tested on a dummy with a mechanical lung. Inside an airtight cell, the lung simulator is subjected to the toxic atmosphere of heat, smoke, and fumes found inside a burning plane. Poison levels inside the cell are monitored continuously. Cyanide, hydrogen fluoride, carbon monoxide. Air inside the smoke hood is monitored continuously as well by specialists from the Accidents Investigation Branch and by industry scientists. The dummy's specially modified mechanical lung breathes in the hot, toxic gases. Then it breathes out the filtered gases into a second set of bottles where cyanide and other poisons should be close to zero. There's plenty of oxygen coming through. And inside this hood, carbon monoxide registers 0. But the temperature inside the hood is rising unacceptably. Later design changes will have to bring this down to tolerable levels. Another CAA criterion is how well a hood deals with carbon dioxide, the waste product of our own normal breathing. If it builds up to more than 10%, people begin to gasp for breath and then pass out. This hood incorporates an extra carbon dioxide scrubber that reduces the carbon dioxide to a safe level. The initial round of trials consisted of 70 tests. Investigator Trimble disclosed some of the promising early results.
We've seen indications of some units which, there is no doubt about it, would have given the majority of passengers at Manchester a real and effective chance of maintaining consciousness and mobility. And that is a key point. The sole tactic thus far in the emergency evacuations has been one of speed of evacuation. Now, our approach is that you cannot achieve that unless you maintain the people in a conscious and mobile situation. And this is why we regard the smoke hood approach as absolutely vital.
In point of fact, the development of a smoke hood is not the only thing, the only hurdle that needs to be overcome. What you need to do is look at test criteria, test procedures that can be adopted for different manufacturers, and you need to look at production time. We're talking about 400,000 seats in the United States aircraft fleet, and probably something on the order of 50 to 100,000 of these would have to be re-equipped every year with smoke hoods based on our experience of the loss of life preservers through our normal attrition and, frankly, pilferage. There's a lot of problem in that regard.
We want to collect good data because...
Although the FAA was as concerned with the economics of smoke hoods as with their life-saving potential, they nonetheless joined Britain, France, and Canada in additional new studies of smoke hoods. The FAA began to look in a modest way at the impact that wearing smoke hoods might have on escape time. These tests, conducted in August 1987, resulted in only a 5-second cost in evacuation time. Even so, critics, including some American manufacturers of smoke hoods, are concerned about product liability, about the human factors, and about how little attention people sometimes pay to safety briefings. Robert Richter.
I think the real problem dealing with the issue of passenger smoke protection really centers around the general public and the fact that the general public is untrained and as such has difficulty in being able to understand or comprehend the equipment that's on board the aircraft now. A good case in point is the decompression that occurred over Albuquerque a number of years ago, which was subsequently investigated by the NTSB, where only 32% of the passengers really knew how to don the passenger oxygen mask. Now that's that little mask that is demonstrated before every flight, where the flight attendants ask for the passenger's absolute attention in trying to define and to demonstrate how that piece of equipment is used. And we perceive the smoke protection equipment, if it is to be successful, will be much more complicated than that.
In Britain, Operation Exit was held to study how people would actually use smoke hoods. Over a 5-day period in April 1987, nearly 1,000 people were rigorously observed in 8 different tests as they were shown hoods for the first time and placed in emergency situations where they had to use them.
Hold it with the rubber neck seal facing you like this. Pull the hood over your head like this. And ensure that the neck seal fits snugly under your chin, and then breathe normally.
5 days of videotape and thousands of pages of data were collected. In conjunction with Trimble's technical data, the results of these trials would go a long way toward convincing the world's aviation community of the value and dependability of smoke hoods.
This is an emergency. Put your smoke hood on and leave the aircraft now. I repeat, this is an emergency. Put your smoke hood on and leave the aircraft now. Move it! Move it! Come on! Move!
This was the largest, most complete test ever, designed to evaluate smoke hoods and how people use them. At the time of this broadcast, the data had not all been fully analyzed, but the organizer of Operation Exit had an early assessment.
Clearly, though, from preliminary figures alone, it would seem that wearing of smoke hoods does not actually make a very significant impact on the time taken by passengers to evacuate an aircraft in an emergency.
Based on these tests and others like them, the CAA will almost certainly mandate the use of smoke hoods on British registered planes within the year. Will the FAA follow suit? For the CAA, the price of smoke hoods is not an issue. But in this era of deregulated air travel, the FAA must include an analysis of cost and benefit.
Well, the bottom line really is that if it's cheaper to kill people than it is to fix it, people are going to die. If it's cheaper to keep them alive than it is to fix it, then they'll go ahead and figure out a way to keep the people alive.
We want the traveling public to understand how much we are asking to be paid for a particular increment of improvement in safety. Clearly, if we have something that might, in theory, improve safety, and it costs a few $100s per aircraft, that's something that would be adopted very quickly. If it costs tens of millions of dollars per aircraft, that's another story entirely, and we have to analyze it. Basically, it's just like unit pricing. When you go into a supermarket and you see a whole array of products, you want to see which box gives you most value for your money. It's the same thing we do when we're looking at fire improvements. We want to know which ones give us the most value for our money, and therefore which ones we can employ earliest, which ones ought to receive further research to lower their cost and maintain that benefit.
Where there are two competing options, say two competing floor lighting systems, or two competing smoke hood systems, you should go with the one that does the better job and has the least cost. But the question of whether to install that safety system, where lives are at stake, should never be subjected to the concerns of economics.
The next time you fly, there probably won't be smoke hoods on board. Safety fuels like ANK will not yet be available. Even 5 years from now, fire hardening will be incomplete. What should you do if there's an accident?
You can survive an accident. Almost every single accident in history that anyone has survived, a flight attendant or crew member has survived that accident. And what that should tell you is that the knowledge of the aircraft and training can help you survive.
Once they're in a fire, they should very quickly move in the direction that the flight attendants tell them to move, get out of the airplane, and don't worry about bringing anything with you.
If they're sitting far away from an exit, they have got to have a smoke mask in their hand. Leave their duty-frees, leave their bags and baggage behind, but pick up the smoke mask. And if breathing becomes untenable, then put it on your head while you're waiting for the exits to clear.
Know where at least 2 or 3 exits are. Know who's around you. Don't be embarrassed to walk on the tops of the seats or on the seat backs. If you have to get from point A to point B, go. Don't wait for a flight attendant to give you instructions. He or she may not be able to give you any instructions.
The biggest factor has been, in over the 200 people I've talked to, has been they had a pre-plan in their mind. They had a plan on what they were going to do if there was an emergency, and they followed it out on their own. They didn't wait to be told what to do, and they didn't really get too hung up on letting things interfere with what they were going to do. Their plan was their goal, and they followed through, and they did it.
John Lennon was gunned down 8 years ago, last December. Investigators are still uncovering unusual facts about his assassin. Killer Mark David Chapman apparently was a celebrity hound in the most literal sense of the expression. Find out more next on Frontline.
For
For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Nova, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Please be sure to include the show title.
Place that 415 million of us flew last year alone. Most of us never think about what we might do if a fire were to break out on board. A fire that would be fast-moving, terrifying, and deadly. There would be panic and hysteria as people struggled to escape. Most of us have no idea how we'd get out or how desperately little time we'd have to do it. In this simulated fire, the volunteers had only a realistic 90 seconds to escape. Those who took longer were considered dead. Accidents in aircraft are very rare. When they do happen, more than 80% are survivable accidents, when the impact itself isn't severe enough to kill people. But over the years, many people have died in survivable accidents, and most of them died from smoke and fire. Paris, France, 1973. This 707 landed only 8 minutes after a fire broke out in a lavatory. 124 passengers and crew died from the smoke and fumes. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, 1980. This L-1011 made an emergency landing with a fire on board. All 301 people, including the captain and crew, died before they could escape. Malaga, Spain, 1982. This DC-10 bound for New York with 394 passengers caught fire when it crashed on takeoff. Flames swept through the crowded fuselage. 50 people died. Manchester, England, 1985. This 737 abandoned takeoff after the captain heard an explosion. The plane, ablaze with burning fuel, continued down the runway. People in the terminal watched helplessly as the crippled aircraft
just dissolved like a little piece of house foil. And there was this tremendous bang, which I must have passed out by then. And the next thing I knew, I was being swabbed down in hospital.
Investigation of the Manchester accident began at once. An engine overdue for maintenance had exploded, igniting thousands of gallons of fuel. Flames melted the windows and entered the cabin even before the plane came to a stop. Evacuation was delayed by panic, confusion, and emergency doors that wouldn't open. 46 of the victims were killed by smoke and toxic gas. The $20 million plane was destroyed. Britain's aviation authorities have corrected the design problem that led to the devastation here. This particular combination of events may never happen again. But why did it happen at all? Are current standards of air fire safety as stringent as technology permits? What regulations protect the flying public? Who makes the regulations and who enforces them? In the United States, 2 government agencies are involved. One is the National Transportation Safety Board.
The Safety Board investigates aviation accidents to determine the probable cause of the accident and to determine as well why the people are killed and injured, and then to make recommendations to, number one, prevent the accident from reoccurring, and secondly, to prevent needless deaths and injury in the future.
Because it is first on the scene of an accident, the Safety Board usually has a very clear picture of what went wrong. After each investigation, it recommends changes to ineffective or obsolete safety regulations. But despite its familiarity with the grim reality of airline accidents, the Safety Board can only recommend changes, not require them. That's the job of the Federal Aviation Administration, which creates and enforces all the regulations that affect air travel in this country. The FAA also conducts its own fire prevention and protection research.
We actually have, in cooperation with industry, an extensive research and development program. Typically, we spend somewhere between $5 and $20 million a year, depending on the year and the projects underway, in research programs designed to understand better how to survive in the event of an accident that involves fire.
The most deadly threat in an aviation accident comes from fuel. Thousands of gallons of kerosene are carried in huge tanks in the wings and fuselage. If those vulnerable tanks rupture, as they easily do in an accident, the spilling fuel can erupt in a spectacular fireball. In the 1940s, researchers used red-colored water in the tanks to discover why liquid fuel was so dangerously explosive. When the fuel tanks rupture, the spilling liquid trails behind. Then it sprays forward in a mist of tiny droplets that would be highly volatile if this were fuel. In lab tests, they saw how liquid kerosene mists and ignites almost instantly when it's propelled over a flame. But when they blended the kerosene with additives to form a kind of gel, it didn't ignite at all. Throughout the 1960s, the FAA experimented with gelled fuels. If gel didn't explode in accidents, hundreds of fire deaths might be prevented. The final test was in 1973.
We ran a series of tests up at Lakehurst using cashiered Navy aircraft, and we had pretty good results up to a certain point. And then, being typical engineers, we wanted to get as much as we could out of that last test. We changed quite a few of the parameters, such as the number of ignition sources, the intensity of the ignition sources, the concentration of the additive.
But perhaps because of those changes, the final test of gelled fuel burned catastrophically.
The FAA got quite skittish at that point and said, "What are we doing here?" Well, those of us that were involved said we weren't making mistakes, we just made...
The craft was engulfed in flames. Many people did escape somehow, but 55 died in a plane that never left the ground. Roy Metcalf was a passenger on that plane.
The flames came through the windows and up onto the ceiling, and all the ceiling started to burn. And then it rapidly spread. It was the heat of the cabin. It was so hot that you could feel your flesh creeping like that. And I think myself that it was the seats, the foam had reached the flash point, and they just went up. And the thick black smoke came down, and that's all there was to breathe. When it got to the top of the aircraft, which was burning, and there were tongues of flames going along the fuselage of the aircraft, this stuff came down like rain. And your ears were filled, your nose was packed out like a gorilla, and your eyes were all full of this filth on the seats. People were on fire. I saw one lady who had just had her hair done, and it must have been very heavily lacquered, because all of a sudden, and her hair went, the lock went, it reached its flash point, and she, in a panic, ran the wrong way. Some people came over the backs of the seats because the aisles were absolutely jammed full of people. And I got into the aisle and went with the crowd, just went with the crowd, which was very, very slow indeed. I couldn't see a thing. I knew I was in row 9, and I had the presence of mind to put my right hand out and count the seats as I went down. And I got to about row 4 and put my hand on somebody's head and knocked the glasses off. And I thought, well, he or she is a goner. And then I got a little further on, and my left foot got caught under somebody's armpit that was on the floor, because there were bodies, seemed to be bodies all over, or in someone's crutch. And that foot was captive with the weight of the people behind me, and I fell then, I think, into row 2. I was choking, this acrid cyanide smoke, 2 whiffs, and I'm quite sure you'd have had it. As I say, I fell into row 2, and I felt this drifting, floating sensation. There was no sense, there was no sight, obviously. There was no, and just before this, the flames were roaring. There was no sense of hearing, no sense of smell, no sense of taste, and no sense of touch. You seemed just to be suspended for, it seemed, about a week. And then I heard a voice saying, "Roy, get onto the floor, the air will be clearer." And I realized that it was my own voice, and that I actually was on the floor. And I always keep a hanky in my top shirt pocket. And I picked the hanky out to try and breathe through it. But my mouth was full of this filth from the seats, and I put my finger in my mouth and brought it out like crumbled OXO cubes. That was all there was to breathe. And then I'd lost my glasses, and I got the hanky and opened my right eye and pulled the handkerchief across my eyeball to get rid of this muck. And by doing that, I saw a little light as big as a postage stamp towards the bottom left. And I made a beeline for it. I've been asked before, did I crawl, did I walk, did I run? I don't know. I'd gone down the chute, head first apparently, through about 4 foot of foam. And as I looked up the chute, I saw the whole top of the airplane.